Good evening, everybody. My name is Zinat Rahman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics. And we're so pleased to welcome you to a conversation about the fight for the right to vote. Before one of our students formally introduces our guests in a few minutes, I'd like to mention our final speaker series event for the academic year and just go over a few housekeeping notes. So on Thursday, May 26th, Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts will talk about politics, policy, and power with CNN's Jeff Zeleny. And that discussion will be at Ida Noyes at 3 p.m., so it's at a special time. And then, of course, after today's discussion, we'll open the floor to take questions from the audience. So please line up to ask your questions at the microphone. And as usual, we'll give first priority to student questions. And please make sure your question is actually a question. As a housekeeping note, please make sure your phones are on silent. And we'll now hear formal introductions from Zoe Torrey, a third year in the college, who is studying public policy and French. And please join me in welcoming Zoe to the podium.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Institute of Politics' latest speaker series event, How We Get to Vote. My name is Zoe Torrey, and I'm a third-year undergraduate at UChicago, originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and studying public policy and French. I'm on the board of the IOP student group with the longest title, Women and Gender Minorities in Public Service Professions, or W+ for short, and I'm honored to be introducing our fabulous guests. Their incredibly prolific careers have not made my job easy. Former Attorney General Eric Holder, as Time magazine noted in their 2014 list of 100 most influential people, has spent his career working, quote, tirelessly to ensure equal justice, end quote. A graduate of Columbia Law School, after holding various legal positions, Mr. Holder was appointed to Deputy Attorney General by former President Bill Clinton. In 2008, he served as a senior legal advisor to former President Barack Obama, who later appointed him to serve as the 82nd United States Attorney General, the first Black American to hold the position. He has since chaired the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which strategizes to redistrict gerrymandered areas in the pursuit of fair congressional district maps. Tonight, we will hear about his new book, Our Unfinished March, which details the history of the right to vote. Representative Jamie Raskin, congressman for Maryland's 8th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives, will moderate tonight's conversation. Representative Raskin began his career as a constitutional law professor at American University's Washington College of Law, where he co-founded the Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project. In 2006, Rep. Raskin became a Maryland state senator and was instrumental in Maryland's legalization of medical marijuana and same-sex marriage, among other legislative victories. A congressman, or federal congressman, since 2017, Rep. Raskin has served on the House Judiciary Committee and chairs the Oversight Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and is a longtime advocate for the fair vote. He was appointed to the House Select Committee investigating the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol and led the second Senate trial to impeach former President Donald Trump. His latest book, entitled Unthinkable, offers insight into his own trauma in 2021 as he simultaneously grieved the loss of his son, Tommy, and confronted the attack on the U.S. Capitol. On Thursday, Congressman Raskin's book, We the Students, was banned in Texas, and And not to be overlooked, on Friday, Vladimir Putin permanently banned Representative Raskin from Russia. Please join me in welcoming former Attorney General Eric Holder and Representative Jamie Raskin.
I'm not sure I want to be sharing a stage with you, man. I mean, like, you got Putin against you, Abbott against you. You're like a dangerous guy, man, you know?
The autocrats and the theocrats will never beat the Democrats.
There we go.
Well, we're here to celebrate your new book, Eric, Our Unfinished March, which is a wonderful series of investigations into the right to vote historically, but also in contemporary American politics. And one thing I like very much about your book is that it intertwines the personal and the political. So I thought I would begin with a personal question, which is, what does the vote mean to you?
That's an interesting question. It really means it is the ultimate conferral of full citizenship. I think about all the people in this country, and we talk about it in the book, who through the history of this country were not really full citizens because they did not have the right to vote, or their right to vote was severely curtailed. And it is, as I said, a measure of the degree of citizenship that you actually have. It's also the tool by which we make change in this country. You know, so-called ordinary citizens banding together and voting in great numbers can change the direction of the country. So it is both, I think, a sign, a signal, a measure, and an effective tool.
Yeah, so it has both a symbolic dimension and then an instrumental dimension that it can be used to get things done. Well, how would you characterize the condition of the right to vote in America today for your readers and potential readers out there?
I think that, and you will know this as well as anybody, and perhaps because of your service on the January 6th committee, maybe better than anybody in this room, I think our democracy is under attack. And I don't think, when I say that, I'm not being an alarmist, I'm not being hyperbolic. I think that is true. And certainly what happened on January 6th, what led up to it, what happened after that is one marker of it. But I think another way to justify what I said is to look at the state of the right to vote in this country. We've seen put in place unnecessary voter suppression measures, you know, photo IDs, long lines, a whole range of things. We've seen partisan and racial gerrymandering. And now we're seeing attacks on the electoral infrastructure of the nation. Like who will actually count the votes. We have a whole bunch of January 6th deniers who are running to be secretaries of state, running to be local election officials, so that the next time this comes around and a president says, well, actually, just find me 18,000 votes or whatever the number was.
11,781 votes.
As I said, he knows more than anybody else. 11,781 votes. You might have somebody on the other end of that phone who'll be receptive to that call and will find a way in which to find 11,781 votes.
So I want to advance a hypothesis with you, Attorney General Holder, and get your general take on it, and then go through each of the pieces of it. But I feel like the majority of Americans now reject insurrection, reject coups, reject the assault on the right to vote, and yet the minority has the majority over a barrel. And we are suffering from a matrix of anti-democracy suppression techniques. And it starts with voter suppression statutes that are put into place by gerrymandered legislatures, which continually redistrict themselves into power decade after decade. Then nothing can be done at the federal level because even if the House of Representatives passes the For the People Act as we did, then we run into the anti-democratic mechanism of the filibuster, which we can't overcome because we don't have the votes to do it at this point. And then the whole system is cemented into place with a packed Supreme Court and all of its anti-democratic decisions, like Shelby County versus Holder. That's you, right?
We always call it the Shelby County case.
The Shelby County case, okay. And decisions like Shaw versus Reno, Miller versus Johnson, dismantling majority African-American and Hispanic districts, and Bush versus Gore, which of course was the Supreme Court intervening to stop the counting of ballots for the first time in American history. First of all, do you think that that captures kind of the network of anti-democracy that we're stuck in as a society right now?
Yeah, that's a good, daunting, and depressing summary. You almost make me want to go back to my hotel and just pull the covers over my head. And go to, you know, yeah, I think that's a good summary of the things that that we face. There are mechanisms that the Republicans have put in place they have made themselves comfortable with being a minority in terms of popular support, a minority party that exercises majority power, and have used a number of the mechanisms that you've talked about. There are also structural mechanisms that we have that have been handed down to us from the founding of the nation that are anti-democratic. The Electoral College, the Senate, where a congressman, a senator from California represents 40 times as many people as a senator does from Wyoming. There's a whole range of things that are anti-democratic. Some, as I said, structurally put together. Others invented since the Republic began. But there's a range of things that we have to face, a range of things that we have to change if we want to get ourselves back on the right track.
So the U.S. Senate itself, which is constructed on an explicitly anti-democratic, anti-majoritarian principle, and the Electoral College are sewn into the constitutional fabric at this point. So that would require fairly dramatic constitutional change ultimately to liberate ourselves from them, although the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact does give us a pathway on the Electoral College. But in any event, the other things that I mentioned are things that are not of a constitutional dimension. The gerrymandering of our districts is not required by the Constitution. Voter suppression statutes are totally voluntary and chosen by GOP majorities in particular states. The filibuster, not only is it not in the Constitution, it's not even in federal law. It's just a rule of the Senate, which already has more than 100 exceptions to it. So, with the Trade Adjustment Act, the Balanced Budget Act, the appointment of judges, judicial nominations, all of these things are done by exceptions to the filibuster rule to make it happen. So we could very easily, the Senate could very easily carve out an exception for voting rights legislation, for example. It just has chosen not to do that. So my question for you is, in general, before we go through each one, do you think it will be possible for us to break out of this matrix of anti-democracy that we seem to be inhabiting as a country right now?
Yeah, I do think we can. And the book is, at the end of the day, I think an optimistic one. The first part of the book looks at the history of this nation and the desire of various groups of people to get the vote. We start with white men who didn't have the right to vote because they didn't own property. And so we talk about a guy named Thomas Dorr, who fomented a rebellion in Rhode Island in the 1840s. Now, I'm not here saying we should foment rebellions, but fomented a rebellion and ultimately won the right to vote for men without property. And then women, then African Americans, and then African Americans again. And facing what seemed at the time, and they were, daunting obstacles, but also facing physical threats, the likes of which we don't necessarily have to deal with now. We talk about Medgar Evers, coming back on the same day that my late sister-in-law integrated the University of Alabama. President Kennedy gives a great speech that outlines basically the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Medgar Evers, 12 o'clock that night, is assassinated. Now, Medgar Evers fought throughout his life for the right for people to register and to vote, and he got killed for that. Those 3 civil rights workers in 1964 who died in Mississippi. We know that they died. People tend to forget. They were down there trying to register people to vote during a freedom summer in Mississippi that was all about getting African Americans to register to vote. John Lewis gets his skull cracked, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in an attempt to get people the vote. So they faced daunting challenges, physical threats. Some gave their lives, and yet women got the right to vote. White men without property got the right to vote. The 1965 Civil Rights Act was put in place. And so I think that the daunting list that you just shared with us is indeed daunting, but it's not impossible to overcome if we will have that same level of commitment and lack of fear that our predecessor Americans had.
So to my mind, the question is, where do you intervene to break the cycle? So let's start with the possibility of redistricting and gerrymandering, which I know you've been spending a few years on now, right? Is the head of this project called the
National Democratic Redistricting Committee.
The National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Okay, so the Supreme Court has essentially washed its hands of gerrymandering, saying it's a political question, it's hopeless, there are no determinate legal standards we can use to define what a gerrymander is. It's not legally cognizable, it's not justiciable. We're out of it. And yet we see in lots of states now judges intervening, as in New York, to overthrow the handiwork of the state legislatures. And then, like in that case, it was, I think, a PhD graduate student from Pennsylvania who drew the new districts for people in New York. And 10 of my Democratic colleagues are all thrown into districts with other Democrats, which is what I hear about on every time I go to the floor now to vote about what's going on and who's running against who and everything. And they're asking me to try to explain, is there any constitutional rhyme or reason to what's going on? So we had put into the For the People Act a legislative directive that there would be nonpartisan redistricting all over the country, that politicians would not choose their own voters. Voters would choose the politicians, but it was rejected by the GOP, which is why I called them the GOP, the gerrymander-only party, because they were openly defending the idea, saying, well, we don't want unelected people drawing districts, we want elected people drawing it. So that was a great frustration to us. But then we said, all right, well, it'll go back to the states. And there's a handful of states where the Democrats control the legislatures compared to the GOP. And yet it seems like the GOP plans have pretty much sailed through, but I might be wrong about that. But the Democratic plans keep getting held up. And so not only do we get all of the evils of gerrymandering, but they're totally one-sided because one party controls a lot more of the machinery of gerrymandering than the other. But tell me, am I wrong about that? And generally, what are you taking from this experience heading up the Democrats' redistricting efforts?
Well, I'm never going to tell a sitting congressman he's wrong. Let me make that perfectly clear. But I would slightly adjust, how's that, what you said, in the sense that, well, first let's understand this. The Republicans, the gerrymandering that they did in 2011, Princeton University looked at it and said it was the worst gerrymandering of the last half century. But Democrats have gerrymandered as well, and we did a lot of gerrymandering, in the 20th century. Gerrymandering has been a part of this country since we have been a republic. In the book, we talk about Patrick Henry, give me liberty, give me death, was involved in gerrymandering in Virginia because it was either James Madison or James Monroe. He hated one of the two of them, and he favored the other one, and he drew a district such that one of the Jameses couldn't get a congressional seat. So we've been dealing with gerrymandering, that long. The Supreme Court did wash its hands of this notion of partisan gerrymandering in the Rucho case, a 5-4 decision that I think will go down as one of the 3 worst of the Roberts Court. The first being Citizens United, the second being Shelby County, the third one being Rucho. Anti-democratic cases, and anti-democracy cases that the Supreme Court put in place. We formed up the NDRC in January of 2017 to try to make sure that this cycle of redistricting was not like the last one that Princeton said was so bad, and to make it as fair as possible. Because the deal is, I think that if the process is fair, Democrats, progressives will do just fine. We will do just fine. And so what we have done is look at a variety of states that we have targeted and used different mechanisms in different states to try to make the process fair. First, to support candidates who would stand for a fair redistricting process, and that means governors usually, usually, in North Carolina the governor doesn't play a role, but usually governors, state legislators always play a role, secretaries of state, the auditor in Ohio, Supreme Court justices at the state level. And so we supported electoral candidates. We've also tried to put in place reform mechanisms. In Michigan, Colorado, Utah, we put in place, or helped put in place, these independent commissions to draw the lines, which was a part of the For the People Act, at least initially, to have non-politicians actually draw the lines, disinterested people draw the lines. And then we brought lawsuits. And the federal courts have not necessarily been receptive, and so we have used the state courts to bring these lawsuits using state constitutions to go after these Republican gerrymanders, and have been, fairly successful in doing so. In North Carolina, in Ohio, which is still pending, in Pennsylvania. There's been a number of places where, again, we have used the state courts, state constitutions to get at the problem. And as you look at it now, if you look at the way in which we try to gauge who's favored in each congressional district, and I guess we've used the Biden vote in a district as opposed to the Trump vote in a district with I don't know, 1 or 2 point number or something like that, we end up with a greater number of potential seats than the Republicans. And so we have stopped what they said they were going to try to do with this redistricting cycle, which is, in their words, to secure a decade of power through the redistricting process. Now, it's entirely possible, but not likely. I don't say possible, and we shouldn't be giving up on this, that we might lose the House in November, but it's not a certainty. But if we do, it will not be because the Republicans have gerrymandered their way into a majority, as they did in 2011. Because after 2011, in the first election after 2012, Democrats got 1.4 million more votes than Republicans for the United States House of Representatives, and we ended up with a 33-seat deficit. 1.4 million more votes, 33 fewer seats than the Republicans. That would not happen this time.
Yeah. Do you think, just as a matter of political science, that there will ever be any way out of gerrymandering as long as we maintain single-member districts? I mean, don't all the districts favor one side or the other in general? And don't we also, for that reason, have, I think, the most absurd political discourse around gerrymandering, because nobody ever defines it? I mean, some people think it's a purely aesthetic or artistic standard. It's, it's like obscenity. You know it when you see it. That looks gerrymandered. For some people, it's how competitive is the district. But, after an anti-gerrymandering decision in Maryland, my district went from being like a 60% Democratic district to an 80% Democratic district. So it's hard to see how that, that's an improvement. I mean, to my mind, the only thing that makes any sense is to say that the overall congressional delegation should roughly correspond to the distribution of votes. But the Supreme Court has specifically rejected that, saying there is no proportional representation command under equal protection. So I think we're just having an absurd kind of conversation and wild goose chase about gerrymandering until we define the terms of it and decide whether or not we really want to say, if one party gets 60% of the votes in a state, they should get 60% of the seats, not 100% of the seats. But we got more than a dozen states now that are sending all Democrats to Congress, like Massachusetts, which has a Republican governor, or all Republicans, like Utah, which has, Democratic mayor in Salt Lake City and so on. But the states themselves are getting polarized, and it just strikes me as a dangerous thing, and we don't have any conceptual clarity in what we're really talking about.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, to try to define what gerrymandering is, it's generally it's where one party is drawing the lines in such a way to favor itself at the expense of the other party, and doing so in an unfair way. All right, that's a pretty, general way of describing it.
But the Supreme Court's allowed that.
Yeah, the Supreme Court has certainly allowed that. Again, but the state Supreme Courts have looked at state constitutional provisions, and said that what is happening in a particular state, North Carolina, I guess being the last one that we won, looked at what the Republicans proposed, looked at the proportionality. It was about a 50-50 state, and North Carolina Republicans were going to give themselves 80% of the congressional seats. The North Carolina Supreme Court looked at the North Carolina Constitution and said, that's unconstitutional. You simply can't do that. The lines have to be redrawn so that there is greater parity and a greater balance than what is seen there. And then the legislators went back and drew the lines in a transparent way that we also said that they needed to do. The line drawing that they did was actually on television, so that you could actually see all right, so Congressman Smith or Representative Smith has a pen, and he's drawing a line on a map, and then that is being broadcast all over the state. Now, I'm not sure how many people were actually watching this, but when that happens, and a politician knows that somebody somewhere is looking at him or her, that tends to maybe cabin what it is they're going to do. But it's certainly different than what we saw in Wisconsin, and this is literally true now. In 2011, the Wisconsin Republicans left the state legislature, went across the street to a law firm office of a firm that represented the Republican Party in a number of things. A few of them went over there and said, all right, just draw the maps. Draw the maps. Walked back across the street to the legislature and told their Republican colleagues, vote on the maps. This is what the maps are going to look like for Wisconsin, for the state legislature. And the Republican folks, well, wait a minute, we want to see the maps. No, just vote on these maps. So they dutifully just voted on the maps. Now, you'd say, well, how do you know that, Eric? Well, because one of the people who was in the room was a young Republican intern who was so turned off by what he saw that he spilled the beans on what it is that they did. So that kind of extreme action we're not likely to see or did not see in what happened in this cycle in 2021. Is it perfect? No. Having what you described, not having single representation or single member districts is probably, I think, maybe the best way to do things. But I just wonder, that is like, for me, climbing Everest. I guess it's possible. The likelihood of me doing it is like slim to none. And so I think that working within the system that we now have, we can make it more fair. Not perfect, but I think we can make it more fair.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not climbing Mount Everest, so that.
The Illinois, by the way, is one state that did have proportional representation in state legislative elections, and Maryland is one where we have multi-member districts, although we don't use a system of proportional representation for voting and counting, but we still have multi-members as a bunch of states do.
And the interesting thing too, though, is so your district goes from 60 to 80%. But you've got to look at Maryland as a whole. The decision that was handed down by, I guess, Judge Lynn Battaglia, she and I were U.S. attorneys together during the Clinton years, actually made the state more competitive generally. There are at least a couple of competitive seats, or at least more competitive seats than there were before. And
it made it slightly more proportional, because Maryland's one of the states where we gerrymander back against Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, and so on. So we have a 7-to-1 split. And we actually made the 8th district, the Republican district, Andy Harris, who's an insurrectionist, made his district much more competitive. And then Battaglia said that's not fair because you're going to make the state less proportional. But and I guess the way I see it is we just have judges who are making it up as they go along. We don't have any kind of standard national interpretation of what gerrymandering is and what the standards are that we're adjudicating districts against. And it might be different in particular states, that might be developing more, but I do hope it's something that either through the For the People Act or another legislation we'll be able to deal with.
Well, and I think that point is a really good one. I mean, had we been able to pass the For the People Act, which contained a ban on partisan gerrymandering, not like, you can do it, no, a ban. You simply can't do it. That would have put us, I think, in a fundamentally different place. Now, it would only apply to federal elections, not state ones. But I think over time, the impact, I think a collateral positive that would have flown from that would have been an impact on state redistricting as well. Yeah. But couldn't get it through the Senate because of the filibuster.
All right. So the basic problem is that in America we have a very deep-rooted belief in everybody's right to vote, everybody's right to participate, at the same time that we have always had the determination by particular groups in power to disenfranchise other people and to keep them from voting. And we're back in one of those periods now, aren't we?
Yeah, there's no question about that. I mean, Republicans have made the determination that they actually fear the people who they say they want to represent, fear the choices, the electoral choices that those people might make. And so they've made the calculation that what they need to do is to try to keep away from the polls those people who give them the greatest amount of fear. And as usual, disproportionately, that's going to be people of color. It's going to be urban dwellers. It's going to be young people. It's going to be women in certain parts of states. And so you end up with things like in Texas, where they say, all right, you've got to have a photo ID in order to prove that you are who you are when you say you want to vote. Brennan Center has done a study, says you're more likely to be hit by lightning than to go to a polling place and try to cast a ballot in a fraudulent way. But all right, so, and there's no statistical proof that this is in any way a problem around the country. But they say you got to come up with a photo ID. All right, if you've got a photo ID that says in Texas you can carry a concealed weapon, that's good. If you are a student at the University of Texas and you have a state-issued ID that has your picture on it, issued by the state of Texas, it's not good enough. So they're making a value judgment, all right? The person who can carry a weapon here, well, he's more likely to be our kind of person, as opposed to the student at the University of Texas at Austin, not likely to be our kind of person. People say, well, if you have a driver's license, that's enough. Well, yeah, that does work, but we also know, if you look statistically, that people of color are less likely to have driver's licenses. So what they said in Texas, well, that's okay. If you don't have a driver's license, you can come up with other ways in which you can get documentation to prove who you are. In fact, we'll make it available to you. You only have to pay $22 to get access to this information. And you only got to travel like a couple hundred miles to do it. So all you got to do is you have to travel, and then you got to pay, in essence, a poll tax. $22 to get your birth certificate and a whole bunch of other stuff so that you can get some kind of state-issued photo ID. So yeah, there is a whole range of things that are being done. And at the end of the day, it is, as you said, this is all about power. This is all about the acquisition and the retention of power. And Republicans have made the determination that they're going to do a whole range of things in order to hold on to the power that they have. They're afraid of what a skinny guy from this city did in putting together a multi-racial, multi-generational coalition back in 2008. They saw the coming America there, the America that demographically is not going to be majority white, I think now by 2043, that is increasingly more ideologically leaning left. We always say we're a center-right country. We're a center-right country. We say it all the time without actually looking. Are we? And we're not. We're really not. We're not, or not as much as we were. And they see, the tea leaves, and they are concerned about that. So they are coming up with all these measures, all these mechanisms, to hold on to their power.
Well, let me ask you a political question then about President Obama and the politics of his midterm elections, because you write about that, about the way that there was just a wipeout in 2010.
2010, yeah.
700 state legislative seats lost. I think it was 63 seats lost in the U.S. House, right. 6 seats lost in the Senate. To what do you attribute that, and how can we prevent that from happening? And was that really the beginning of the period that we're in now?
In some ways, I think it was. The rise of the Tea Party was actually kind of the seeds of the stuff that we have seen, or that we are now experiencing. And the fertilizer for that growth was Trump. That's interesting. What's just struck me, I was thinking fertilizer is, okay, anyway. But, he helped those seeds grow that were planted then. The Tea Party was ostensibly against the Affordable Care Act, But boy, you saw really quickly how ugly it got. You know, things that they said about Barack, things they said about Michelle, the way in which, you know, African American, the way they were depicted, you know, in pictures and stuff. And there was an ugly component to that. That wasn't a policy. It wasn't about a policy. It ultimately became about who these people were, and for that matter, who this who their, you know, attorney general was as well. And so that. There was that reaction. You know, I remember being here, you know, the night of election in 2008, and how hopeful I was. Not that we were going to be in a post-racial America. I didn't buy into that, but that we had maybe turned a corner, that we were going to be on a path to get us to the right place. But boy, it didn't take long for you know, for that to turn.
So how do you understand going from millions of votes surplus for Obama-Biden in 2008 to just 2 years later? I mean, I understand, you know, that there was that right-wing reaction, but how did we lose the momentum and lose that large, multiracial, multi-ethnic majority? Part
of it is that Democrats, progressives, we're not the most disciplined people in the world. And we all came out, hey, Barack's running for president. Let's do this, man. Let's go. It's 2010. I got other stuff to do. So turnout was a huge problem. You had this energy, the energization of the Republican base around the election of Obama, the Affordable Care Act, and all the stuff that grew out of that, and apathy on the part of Democrats. And then there's also history. You know, the new president, first midterm, always does poorly. That's, I guess, since Roosevelt, there may be one or two exceptions. So I think the combination of all of that led to what Barack described as that shellacking in 2010, which gave the Republicans the gerrymandering power that they used in 2011 to secure a decade of power for the course of the decade that we have now exited. And a lot of those legislative majorities continue to this day. Yeah. And they're drawing them again. All right, I want to ask you one last question, then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. But I was moved by everything you wrote in the book. The one thing that I kind of disagreed with, but maybe it's just more of a personal take on it, but your sense that the Supreme Court has taken a dive recently, and you have a kind of romantic faith in the Supreme Court, a belief in the Supreme Court, which is one reason you became a judge, I know, to start off your career in public life. Hasn't the Supreme Court, for the vast majority of our history, been a profoundly reactionary institution? I mean, all the way through the 18th and 19th century, I mean, it did nothing for enslaved people other than adopt the Dred Scott decision defining African Americans as permanently not citizens, people who the white man has is not bound to respect in any way. And then even after the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, we get Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court constitutionalizing Jim Crow, separate but equal American apartheid. And so there is that brief period of the Warren Court where we get Brown versus Board and Roe versus Wade and Miranda versus Arizona. But then that very quickly disappears, and we're back to the Berger Court, the Rehnquist Court, the Roberts Court. And I mean, isn't it time for progressives to fall out of love with the Supreme Court, to fight for it as much as we can, but to understand that the only real power we've ever had in the country is by organizing people? Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that at all, actually. No, I don't disagree with that. And I guess what I was trying to write, I talk about going to the Supreme Court and coming to Washington, D.C. for the first time when I was, I guess, after my second year in law school, to file something on behalf of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and basically just get on an airplane, go down to the Supreme Court, file this thing, and then get back to New York, Eric. That was, that was the entirety of my responsibility. And it just struck me that I was at the Supreme Court, first time I'd ever been there. They gave me a little pamphlet, the history of the justices and all of that stuff. And I was really taken by that experience. But the point that you make is indeed a good one. I at that age, at 23, I wanted to believe that the court, growing up for me, I experienced the Warren Court. That just happened to coincide with my coming of age, my consciousness, and I tended to think of the Supreme Court in that way. As a law student, I got to see, that wasn't necessarily the truth. And your assessment of the court as a pretty regressive institution is, in fact, right. But the court is there, and it does have enormous amounts of power, which is why, I say we've got to expand the court to deal with those 2 stolen seats. I mean, Merrick Garland can't get a hearing because he's too close to the election. That's inconsistent with practice. But Amy Coney Barrett can get on the court while people are actually voting. So those are 2 seats. And if Merrick had been on the court after Scalia died, that court would have been 5-4 progressive. And a whole range of decisions, the Rucho decision, for instance, with regard to gerrymandering, would have gone the other way, I'm sure. The Janus case deals with labor unions and dues, and so that I'm sure would have gone the other way. A whole range of decisions. And I think we'd have a 5-4 Supreme Court now. And so Roe would not be, being examined in the way that it is. So I say expand the court. 18-year terms. We have people who serve on the Supreme Court now, 30, 40 years. They're looking for 10-year-olds to put on the court in the hope that they could serve for 80 years or something like that. Limit them. And this is actually a place where, as we say in the book, the Chief Justice and I are in the same place. He says 15 years, I say 18 years. And then have, this is I guess my most radical thing, is to have the justices appointed 2 justices per term for every president. The president would appoint a Supreme Court justice in his or her first year and third year. And that way you constantly, and if you have 18-year terms, you would ultimately bring the court back to 9, ultimately, but not initially, but ultimately back to 9 justices. And I think
that's a great idea. So each president would get 2 appointments rather than just depending on the arbitrary fact of who happens to leave.
Yeah, because when the Supreme Court was first constituted, people left the court when they left this earth, when they died. They died and they left the Supreme Court. People didn't live as long. When we say they should serve for life, they didn't live as long. Now, we live longer periods than folks did in the 18th century, and we have these justices who make these decisions. Well, I'm going to retire as a Republican. I'm going to retire now. As opposed to, I love her to death. Justice Ginsburg did not. She had an opportunity, did not do it, and died at an inopportune time in terms of who the president was to replace her. Same thing was true of Thurgood Marshall. Justice Breyer was under enormous pressure to retire while President Biden was or is in office, in the same way that Justice Kennedy retired so that a Republican would appoint his successor. And so we've got that other reality to deal with. So that's why I have these series of reforms for what we need to do with the Supreme Court. But I think what we have to realize, getting back to your point, is that the Supreme Court, the Warren Court was an exception. It has not been the friend of progressives, I would say friends of the people. And so we've got to win more elections. We've got to win elections. That's where organizing and winning elections, that's where I think we have to put our emphasis. And then let's reform the court to the extent that we can. And in the first instance, expand the damn thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you for writing this book. So now we're going to go to the questions. And do people just approach the microphone? All right. Approach the microphone if you have a question for
the first person always shows the greatest amount of courage, because the second, third, that's easy,
Gentlemen, don't you think that the Democrats could do better with messaging? And I would like to make 2 suggestions. One, instead of calling it the filibuster, which seems kind of innocuous and people don't know what that means, call it the democracy buster. And in terms of gerrymandering, why don't you call that district rigging?
You should answer this as well. But I think, messaging and message discipline are not necessarily the strengths of Democrats. And that really kind of amazes me, given the fact that we've got way more creative people who identify themselves as Democrats. We can just go to Hollywood and say, hey, Steven Spielberg, not Steven Spielberg, I mean, somebody in Hollywood come up with some kind of catchy whatever to describe the filibuster or gerrymandering, but then we've got to stick with it, the little, well, the folks, the Republicans, they'll come up with a phrase, and boy, they'll just boom, boom, on message, on message, on message. And we've got a bunch of we have free agents when we need some message. For instance, between now and November, we should have a set of talking points that we stick to, and maybe we have, I don't know, that talk about all the great things that Democrats have done in these first couple of years. And then also talk about, put a little bit of fear in the American people about, you might not be totally happy with us, but look what these idiots are going to do. You put them in office, and these are the kinds of things that you're going to have to deal with. You know? Idiots, that's a technical term.
Yes, sir.
No, you were supposed to answer the question, too.
But I can talk about this all night, and you guys didn't come to hear me. But I'll just say, here's my suggestion for a message, because I hear this question everywhere I go. Teach your children and your grandchildren what I teach the young people in our Democracy Summer Project. Everything that you need to know about voting is everything you need to know about driving. If you want to go forward, you put it in D. If you want to go backwards, you put it in R. That's all you need to understand.
See? Get your damn colleagues to say that.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yes, sir.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Mitch Robson, and I'm a second year at the college. This question's for Congressman Raskin. Appreciate very much that you've taken the time to come speak with us. So last week, you might recall you were questioned by Catherine Glenn Foster about your stance on abortion. You criticized her proposed abortion ban because it had no exceptions for rape or incest. Yet when she asked you the question, if we added rape and incest exceptions, would you vote for it? You ignored the question, said that you'd reclaim your time.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering...
First of all, I didn't hear what she had to say, but it's a very easy answer to her, which is, no, I wouldn't accept that, because I support a woman's constitutional right to choose under Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So that I wish I had heard that. That's a simple question. The key thing is that the official Republican witness before the Judiciary Committee, the one that they assigned to come out there, came out for a nationwide criminal ban on abortion with no exceptions for rape or incest. So that's just Handmaid's Tale stuff. So I debate her any day of the week about that. So yeah, she was out there saying, he didn't answer my question. First of all, she wasn't asking the questions, I was. Okay, so I didn't hear what she had to say, but I'm very happy to answer her question. I support a woman's right to choose, which we've had in Supreme Court precedent for the last 50 years. And I don't know where you are on that.
Sure, I was just asking because I'm curious, like, we want to make sure, voters are informed. I feel like we can tend to use the rape or incest exceptions, which are only 1.5% of abortions, to kind of dodge the crux of the Roe v. Wade issue.
How about you not dodge it then? Where are you on that? Do you think women who are raped should have the right to have an abortion, or do you think there should be government-compelled birth at that point?
I'm a pro-life student. I think it's wrong to intentionally, take a life.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad you said it. So her position and your position are clear, and my position's clear. I stand with where the Supreme Court doctrine is. So, I don't know why she thought she was playing some kind of game of gotcha with me. My position's been 1,000% clear.
All right, well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
But you know what? Here's the deal. All these folks, and I'm not talking about you, I'm not personalizing this, these congressmen, some congresswomen, and state legislators, men and women, if it's their girl who's pregnant, who's 16 years old, rape, incest, or not rape or incest, and they're faced with that determination, do we terminate the pregnancy or do we let it go? you watch where they are at that point. Now, it'll be, you know, in a state that's banned, maybe it's Oklahoma or something, they'll find the money to take that 16-year-old girl, daughter, to a place where, you know, they can do that which they think is in the best, what the girl wants, what they think is in the best interest of their daughter. You know,
I would take it one step further. We had a very vehement anti-abortion, pro-life Republican congressman who resigned from Congress after his mistress came out and said that he had required her or urged her to have an abortion. And then he just resigned from Congress at that point. So,
but the other thing is, you know, these are tough moral, religious, and ethical issues. And I'm not sure I have all the answers about what's right, you know, when does life begin? But nobody else does either, you know? There's no definitive answer that leads to a clear decision. And so I think leaving it up to the woman to decide with whoever she wants to consult with to make these, women don't say, boy, you know, I'd like to have an abortion. I think I'll get pregnant. We'll see what that's, we'll see what that's. That doesn't happen. You know, it doesn't happen. And so leaving to them the decision, that tough decision, without any clear, there are no clear answers, is the best way to go.
You know, Eric, I've got a colleague who's a Republican congresswoman from South Carolina named Nancy Mace, she's the ranking member on the subcommittee that I chair, the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And she became famous in South Carolina. She's the first woman ever to graduate from the Citadel, when the Republican caucus, which she was part of and was a majority in South Carolina, was about to ban abortion in every case. And she got up and she said, I will oppose this because I was raped.
Right.
And no government official, no politician is going to tell me that I've got to have my rapist's baby. So that was a Republican who took that position. But at this point, the GOP in Washington is way beyond that, and they're taking the position that was outlined by the, by the eloquent student before, which is that they are opposed to abortion in every and all case, because a life is a life, and they consider a murder in every case. So that position is supported by maybe 15 or 20% of the American people, and that's who the Republican Party stands for now, just like they stand with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and those people who are waging insurrection and coups against the government.
And last thing, maybe just on abortion, we keep talking about exceptions, and we've really kind of focused on this rape and incest, you know? But they're actually taking away this notion of health of the mother. You know, that's another exception that there's no exceptions. Rape, incest, health of the mother. We focus on rape and incest, and understandably, but health of the mother, you know, that is one that, again, I thought we were in a good place as a nation, but that's not, doesn't appear to be the case.
Please.
Thank you. My name's Arjun. I'm a joint degree master's with the Booth School of Business and the Harris School of Public Policy. My question is, this was sort of alluded to at the start of your conversation. Post-2020, we've seen efforts or talks from traditionally red states to put potentially partisan loyalists in charge of elections within states. And I find myself worrying about things like whether it's voter intimidation, throwing out of votes, so on and so forth. And I guess I'm wondering, do you have in mind actions that we can take, given like whether it's the state of the Senate right now or any other sort of gridlock? Because I'm worried we'll be just wringing our hands or licking our wounds or analyzing a post-mortem in 2022 or 2024 and say like there was nothing we could really do. But I'm curious what you see as what we can do.
Well, I think as the congressman said before, organize. You know, that's what this book talks about. People organized, got people the ability to vote, and then got them to vote. A lot of these folks who run elections at the local level are elected officials, and so that means voting for the person who you think is going to do the job in a neutral and appropriate way. You know, we did studies at the NDRC that showed that progressives, this is really an amazing thing, who vote, will vote at the top of the ticket, you know, president, senator, governor, but as you go down the ticket, they don't vote. Because, and it's an interesting thing, you ask them, well, why didn't you? Well, I didn't really know who the candidates were. I didn't know what their positions were. in some ways, or that, I kind of respect that. I didn't want to cast a vote for somebody I didn't know, even though they got Democrat next to the name or Republican next to the name. But we found that Republicans, by contrast, up and down the ticket, from the top all the way down, just R. And so it's a question of getting out there and getting people organized, getting them to vote, getting to understand that so-called down ballot races. I hate that term because it somehow means that they are less important, and they're not. They are important. Vote every time and vote for every person, cast a ballot for every person who's running in an election.
And I would just add to it, look, democracy itself is on the ballot in 2022.
Absolutely.
And 2024. And now constitutional freedom is on the ballot in 2022 and 2024. And people may have very sincerely held views on both sides, those who I think the majority that stand with Roe versus Wade and a constitutional right to privacy, and those who think there should be a nationwide criminal ban on what is today a constitutional right. I think your generation should be engaged in a democratic upsurge over this all across the country. But you got to wake people up, and you got to wake up every day between now and the election saying, I'm going to go and find 10 voters today, or 10 people who aren't registered yet, and I'm going to register them. And we're going to figure out ways to do this. So, mobilize all of the creativity of the classroom and the ingenuity of the students to figure out how to make this happen and make it counter-cyclical, because everybody says, oh, well, the party of the president is going to lose seats in the midterm elections. We can't afford that. I mean, everything's on the ballot. Democracy, freedom, all over the world. And then because of climate change, we just don't have much time for the normal rhythms of electoral cycles. We've got to organize people to win.
This is not the normal midterm election. I mean, what you said is exactly right. Democracy is on the ballot in a whole number of ways. And we have got to vote. Young people need to understand you all are the largest voting bloc in this country right now. You've passed the baby boomers. And yet boomers, that's my generation, we still have disproportionate amounts of power because we vote at a higher percentage than you do. You get young people out, not even to the same degree that boomers vote, but just to a much greater degree than they vote now, and you can change the direction of this country.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Seth Cohn, and I'm a second year in the college. Attorney General Holder, my question is for you, and it's about you talking about Texas needing voter ID laws. In my wallet, I possess a CCL, a concealed carry license card, and a fire identification card. These cards, which cost money, required identifying documents, and took 9 months to come in the mail, are required for me to utilize my Second Amendment right. Is this not suppressing access to my rights as a U.S. citizen? And I'm comparing this to voting, which, of course, I believe that every eligible citizen should be able to vote, and it should be as easy as possible. However, I don't believe that requiring someone to show an ID, which they have to do when they get on a plane, when they drink alcohol, when they drive a car, is a barrier for people to be able to vote.
Yeah, I mean, the studies will show that depending on what it is that you require people to have in order to vote can have a disproportionate negative impact on a person's or a group's ability to vote. And what Senator Manchin had in the last iteration of the, I guess it was the John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act when they put them both together, I think is a good position. I'm really against photo ID, but not necessarily voter ID. You ought to come up with, if you allow people to, in a reasonable way, demonstrate that I am, in fact, Eric Holder. But I don't have to have necessarily a state-issued ID. There are a whole range of things that I could be able to present to a person at a poll that would prove that I am who I claim to be. Not be as prescriptive as some of these state laws are. So yeah, and I think that's just the reality, because 80% of the people, I think, in this country do agree with at least part of what you've said, which is that you should actually prove that you are who you are when you want to cast a ballot. This is in spite of the fact that this is supposed to stop in-person voter fraud. That never happens. But I'm dealing with a kind of a political reality here that people, Democrats, Republicans say, yeah, it kind of makes sense. But I think Senator Manchin actually got this one right, which is to say not just these 3-4 state-issued things, but a whole range of other things that you can present. He's a former Secretary of State in West Virginia, a whole range of other things that you can show to prove that you are who you claim to be.
My name is Richard Gershenson. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for coming tonight and for your outstanding service to the country. It's quite clear that Trump is guilty of a multitude of criminal activities. Do you think that he will be brought to trial? And if he is brought to trial, how would you pick a jury?
Well, hey, you're looking at a former judge in the D.C. Superior Court, so and a former attorney general. So why don't we hear from you first, and I'll opine.
Profiles encourage here, folks. I think that, could you pick a jury? The trial would presumably be, well, there's a trial in Atlanta, potentially. Find me 11,781 votes. There's a potential trial there. All these high-profile matters, whether it's the O.J. Simpson trial or whatever, you can find jurors who can be qualified. It's not a question of did you ever hear about what Donald Trump is accused of, what O.J. Simpson was accused of. It's a question of can you put that out of your mind and make a decision, vote guilty or not guilty, only on the basis of what it is that's presented to you in the courtroom. Peremptory challenges, challenges for cause. You could seat a jury. If I were the judge in that case, I'd seat a jury of 12 and have about 20 alternates, just because there'll be a whole range of things that are going to happen, and whoop, juror number 11 is going to go. Let's put in a substitute. So I think you could do that. The question as to whether or not he will be indicted, I think will be interesting, and I think, not to put too much pressure on you, but what the January 6th committee does with its hearings in June, I'm not sure they start in June as I understand it, I think is really going to have an impact on the nation. There are going to be certain people going to, no matter what it is shown, they're going to believe he can't be indicted, he didn't do anything wrong. Those are the same folks who believe that, the moon landing was faked. I mean, you're just not going to get to everybody. But I think the vast majority of the American people are going to be moved, I think, by what the January 6th committee will present. And I think that's also going to probably put pressure on the Justice Department to bring cases against people in the White House, people at the Justice Department, people potentially in Congress. There are a range of people, including the former president. So we'll see we'll see what happens. But I also think that we should not assume that the Justice Department is doing nothing. Given all that we know from a variety of sources, including the January 6th committee, there's a range of stuff to start what we call a predicate investigation. This is not a full field investigation, which is when you put all FBI agents out doing a whole range of things. But a minimum investigation, they have to be at that level. And my guess would be they're probably into a much larger investigation as well. But holding off on talking about it as they should, because you don't talk about an investigation if you're the Attorney General. You don't talk about ongoing investigations. And so he's hampered in what he can share. But my guess is that there's an investigation underway. And
well, on that point, I just want to say Merrick Garland is my constituent, so I don't speak ill of my constituents. But I think that the Department of Justice has been making a lot of headway in terms of the prosecutions. I think there are more than 800 charges that have been brought in the largest criminal investigation in the history of the DOJ against people for everything from assaulting federal officers to the criminal trespass, the interference with federal proceeding, seditious conspiracy, which several of the Oath Keepers and other domestic violent extremists have pleaded guilty to already. And they're working their way up the way that the prosecutors do in a mob prosecution. So I have every reason to believe that they'll take it all the way to the top. Now, having said that, having been the lead impeachment manager over in the Senate in the second impeachment, I know that Donald Trump acts like a mob boss in the sense that he insulates himself with several layers of people between him and the criminal actions that are taking place, which makes it tough. It means you've got to proceed basically on circumstantial evidence, which is fine as a matter of law. People are convicted every day based on circumstantial evidence, and that's pretty much what you need to prove intent. But I can understand the caution with which the Department of Justice is apparently proceeding here. On the juror question, I think the Attorney General here is right that you can compose a jury of people who are neutral and objective, even if they've heard things that they can say. They can put whatever predispositions or biases aside in order to listen to the evidence, which is something I wish we had had in the U.S. Senate, because the Senate jurors had sworn 2 oaths of office, and one was as senators to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and then they had sworn an additional oath to render impartial justice as jurors in this case. And yet a lot of them went on TV before the trial even took place and said that they thought that Trump was innocent, or in some cases he was guilty, although I'm not sure I saw those, but certainly that Trump was innocent, or the Senate really didn't have the power to conduct a trial or what have you. And I think what we ended up with in the end was perhaps the greatest case of jury nullification in American history, because the evidence was so overwhelming that the president had incited violent insurrection against the Union. And all of the law, I think we showed, was on our side. And yet Senator McConnell got up when it was all over, presumably speaking for those who voted not to convict, and he said, well, he felt that the president was singularly, factually, morally responsible for the events of that day. It was him, and yet he said the Senate did not have the power to conduct the trial, didn't have jurisdiction, a legal question we had disposed of on the very first day of the trial in a vote of 54 to 46. So it's sort of like in a criminal prosecution, if the court rejects a suppression motion based on the Fourth Amendment of a gun and says, no, that gun is lawful evidence, there was no violation of Fourth Amendment rights, and then the jury comes back later and says, well, he clearly killed the guy, but we think that the gun was unlawfully entered into evidence. But it had already been decided as a matter of law, based incidentally on more than 2 centuries of Senate precedent rejecting precisely that argument, most prominently in the Belknap decision after the Civil War. So that's why we're in the situation we're in. We got, in 57 to 43, the most sweeping bipartisan presidential conviction vote in American history, and yet we fell 10 votes short still. There have only been 4 impeachments in our history: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton for doing you-know-what, Trump 1, and then Trump 2. And this was the closest we ever came. But the framers clearly underestimated the hold that political partisanship would have over senators, even senators acting as jurors in a case like this. But we do have robust bicameral, bipartisan majorities, 17 different Republicans who joined us in finding, as a matter of legislative fact, that Donald Trump had incited insurrection against the Union.
Yeah, I see that we're running out of time. So here's maybe where I think I'd like to end. We're here to, first I want to thank you, Congressman. You're a very busy man, and the fact that you decided to come here and spend some time with us is much appreciated. This is we too often paint with too broad a brush about elected officials and, our Congress in particular. There are a whole bunch of really dedicated, intelligent people up there trying to do their damnedest to uphold our founding ideals, and Jamie Raskin is chief among them. He's a good guy.
Thank you.
And what I'd also say, maybe to end this, is to say that, first off, buy this book. It's an accessible book. You'll find it an easy read. But Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But here's the deal. It doesn't bend on its own. We've talked about a lot of people being dissatisfied. We're dissatisfied. The question is, how do we bend that arc? It only bends when people like us put our hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And what we talk about in the book are a whole bunch of ordinary citizens doing, fairly extraordinary things to kind of pull that arc towards justice. And what I would ask you all to ask yourselves is, what are you doing? What are you doing to bend that arc and pull it towards justice? It's not enough to watch, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and throw things at the TV, and yell. It's not enough, What is it that you are doing? I've got this little artificial thing that I do Sunday night around 7, 8 o'clock when it gets relatively quiet in my house. I think about the week past and what did I do, help bend that arc. What am I going to do in the week to come? Doesn't mean you've got to be as accomplished a congressman as Jamie Raskin or a former attorney general. You don't have to do that. There are a whole range of things that you can do to make this country better. They don't even have to be political things. There are young people in this country starved for the kind of attention that every American kid deserves. And so you could, spend an hour or two a week engaged in that kind of activity. It'll be hard. You've got important personal lives. You've got business lives and professional lives to deal with. But if you make the time to do that, you're going to feel better about yourself, and you're going to make this nation better as well. So I would urge you, find the time to give back to this this great country. I think it's the greatest country in in the history of the world. I think this is an exceptional nation, and we are most exceptional when the American people are most engaged. And this is a time. Democracy is on the ballot. This is a time for us all to be engaged and have our hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. We can do this.
Thank you, Attorney General Holder.